A foreign title, is always very useful for purposes of swindles and frauds, remarked the man in the corner to Polly one day. The cleverest robberies of modern times were perpetrated lately in Vienna by a man who dubbed himself Lord Seymour, whilst over here the same class of thief calls himself Count something ending in O, or Prince the other, ending in off. Fortunately for our hotel and lodging housekeepers over here, she replied, they are beginning to be more alive to the ways of foreign swindlers, and look upon all titled gentry who speak broken English as possible swindlers or thieves. The results sometimes being exceedingly unpleasant to the real grand seigneurs who honor this country at times with their visits, replied the man in the corner. Now, take the case of Prince Semyonix, a man whose 16 quarterings are duly recorded in Gotha, who carried enough luggage with him to pay for the use of every room in an hotel for at least a week, whose gold cigarette case with diamond and turquoise ornament was actually stolen without his taking the slightest trouble to try and recover it. That same man was undoubtedly looked upon with suspicion by the manager of the Liverpool Northwestern Hotel from the moment that his secretary, a dapper, somewhat vulgar little Frenchman, bespoke on behalf of his employer, with himself and a valet, the best suite of rooms the hotel contained. Obviously those suspicions were unfounded, for the little secretary, as soon as Prince Semyonix had arrived, deposited with the manager a pile of banknotes, also papers and bonds, the value of which would exceed tenfold the most outrageous bill that could possibly be placed before the noble visitor. Moreover, H.M. Albert Lambert explained that the prince, who only meant to stay in Liverpool a few days, was on his way to Chicago, where he wished to visit Princess Anna Semyonix, his sister, who was married to Mr. Gerwin, the great copper king and multimillionaire. Yet, as I told you before, in spite of all these undoubted securities, suspicion of the wealthy Russian prince lurked in the minds of most Liverpudlians who came in business contact with him. He had been at the Northwestern 2 days when he sent his secretary to Window and Vassall, the jewelers of Bold Street, with a request that they would kindly send a representative round to the hotel with some nice pieces of jewelry, diamonds, and pearls chiefly, which he was desirous of taking as a present to his sister in Chicago. Mr. Winslow took the order from M. Albert with a pleasant bow. Then he went to his inner office and consulted with his partner, Mr. Vassall, as to the best course to adopt. Both the gentlemen were desirous of doing business, for business had been very slack lately, neither wished to refuse a possible customer, or to offend Mr. Pettit, the manager of the Northwestern, who had recommended them to the prince. But that foreign title and the vulgar little French secretary stuck in the throats of the two pompous and worthy Liverpool jewelers, and together they agreed, firstly, that no credit should be given, and, secondly, that if a check or even a banker's draft were tendered, the jewels were not to be given up until a check or draft was cashed. Then came the question as to who should take the jewels to the hotel. It was altogether against business etiquette for the senior partners to do such errands themselves. Moreover, it was thought that it would be easier for a clerk to explain, without giving undue offense, that he could not take the responsibility of a check or draft, without having cashed it previously to giving up the jewels. Then there was the question of the probable necessity of conferring in a foreign tongue. The head assistant, Charles Needham, who had been in the employ of Winslow and Vassall for over 12 years, was, in true British fashion, ignorant of any language save his own. It was therefore decided to dispatch Mr. Schwartz, a young German clerk lately arrived, on the delicate errand. Mr. Schwartz was Mr. Winslow's nephew and godson, a sister of that gentleman having married the head of the great German firm of Schwartz & Company, silversmiths, of Hamburg and Berlin. The young man had soon become a great favorite with his uncle, whose heir he would presumably be, as Mr. Winslow had no children. At first Mr. Vassall made some demur about sending Mr. Schwartz with so many valuable jewels alone in a city which he had not yet had the time to study thoroughly, but finally he allowed himself to be persuaded by his senior partner, and a fine selection of necklaces, pendants, bracelets, and rings, amounting in value to over £16,000, having been made, it was decided that Mr. Schwartz should go to the Northwestern in a cab the next day at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This he accordingly did, the following day being a Thursday. Business went on in the shop as usual under the direction of the head assistant, until about 7 o'clock, when Mr. Winslow returned from his club, where he usually spent an hour over the papers every afternoon, and at once asked for his nephew. To his astonishment, Mr. Needham informed him that Mr. Schwartz had not yet returned. This seemed a little strange, and Mr. Winslow, with a slightly anxious look in his face, went into the inner office in order to consult his junior partner. Mr. Vassall offered to go round to the hotel and interview Mr. Pettit. "I was beginning to get anxious myself," he said, "but did not quite like to say so. I have been in over half an hour, hoping every moment that you would come in, and that perhaps you could give me some reassuring news. I thought that perhaps you had met Mr. Schwartz, and were coming back together." However, Mr. Vassall walked round to the hotel and interviewed the hall porter. The latter perfectly well remembered Mr. Schwartz sending in his card to Prince Semyonix. "At what time was that?" asked Mr. Vassall. "About 10 minutes past 3, sir, when he came. It was about an hour later when he left." "When he left," gasped, more than said, Mr. Vassall. "Yes, sir. Mr. Schwartz left here about 4:15, sir." "Are you quite sure?" "Quite sure. Mr. Pettit was in the hall when he left, and he asked him something about business. Mr. Schwartz laughed and said, 'Not bad.' 'I hope there's nothing wrong, sir,' added the man. Oh, nothing, thank you. Can I see Mr. Pettit?" "Certainly, sir." Mr. Pettit, the manager of the hotel, shared Mr. Vassall's anxiety. Immediately he heard that the young German had not yet returned home. "I spoke to him a little before 4 o'clock. We had just switched on the electric light, which we always do these winter months at that hour. But I shouldn't worry myself, Mr. Vassall. The young man may have seen to some business on his way home. You'll probably find him in when you go back." Apparently somewhat reassured, Mr. Vassall thanked Mr. Pettit and hurried back to the shop, only to find that Mr. Schwartz had not returned, though it was now close on 8 o'clock. Mr. Winslow looked so haggard and upset that it would have been cruel to heap reproaches upon his other troubles or to utter so much as the faintest suspicion that young Schwartz's permanent disappearance with £16,000 in jewels and money was within the bounds of probability. There was one chance left, but under the circumstances a very slight one indeed. The Winslows' private house was up the Birkenhead end of the town. Young Schwartz had been living with them ever since his arrival in Liverpool, and he may have either not feeling well or for some other reason gone straight home without calling at the shop. It was unlikely, as valuable jewellery was never kept at the private house, but it just might have happened. "It would be useless," continued the man in the corner, "and decidedly uninteresting, were I to relate to you Messrs. Winslow's and Vassall's further anxieties with regard to the missing young man. Suffice it to say that on reaching his private house Mr. Winslow found that his godson had neither returned nor sent any telegraphic message of any kind. Not wishing to needlessly alarm his wife, Mr. Winslow made an attempt at eating his dinner, but directly after that he hurried back to the Northwestern Hotel, and asked to see Prince Semyonix. The prince was at the theater with his secretary, and probably would not be home until nearly midnight. Mr. Winslow, then, not knowing what to think, nor yet what to fear, and in spite of the horror he felt of giving publicity to his nephew's disappearance, thought it his duty to go round to the police station and interview the inspector. It is wonderful how quickly news of that type travels in a large city like Liverpool. Already the morning papers of the following day were full of the latest sensation, mysterious disappearance of a well-known tradesman. Mr. Winslow found a copy of the paper containing the sensational announcement on his breakfast table. It lay side by side with a letter addressed to him in his nephew's handwriting, which had been posted in Liverpool. Mr. Winslow placed that letter, written to him by his nephew, into the hands of the police. Its contents, therefore, quickly became public property. The astounding statements made therein by Mr. Schwartz created, in quiet, businesslike Liverpool, a sensation which has seldom been equaled. It appears that the young fellow did call on Prince Semionic's at 3:15 on Wednesday, December 10th, with a bag full of jewels, amounting in value to some £16,000. The prince duly admired, and finally selected from among the ornaments a necklace, pendant, and bracelet, the whole being priced by Mr. Schwartz, according to his instructions, at £10,500. Prince Semionic's was most prompt and businesslike in his dealings. "You will require immediate payment for these, of course," he said in perfect English, "and I know you business men prefer solid cash to checks, especially when dealing with foreigners. I always provide myself with plenty of Bank of England notes in consequence," he added with a pleasant smile, "as £10,500 in gold would perhaps be a little inconvenient to carry. If you will kindly make out the receipt, my secretary, Emmu Lambert, will settle all business matters with you." He thereupon took the jewels he had selected and locked them up in his dressing case, the beautiful silver fillings of which Mr. Schwartz just caught a short glimpse of. Then, having been accommodated with paper and ink, the young jeweler made out the account and receipt, whilst Emmu Lambert, the secretary, counted out before him 105 crisp Bank of England notes of £100 each. Then, with a final bow to his exceedingly urbane and eminently satisfactory customer, Mr. Schwartz took his leave. In the hall he saw and spoke to Mr. Pettit, and then he went out into the street. He had just left the hotel and was about to cross towards St. George's Hall when a gentleman, in a magnificent fur coat, stepped quickly out of a cab which had been stationed near the curb, and, touching him lightly upon the shoulder, said with an unmistakable air of authority, at the same time handing him a card, "That is my name. I must speak with you immediately." Schwartz glanced at the card, and by the light of the arc lamps above his head read on it the name of Dmitri Slaviansky Burgrenev, de la II Section de la Police Impériale de SM Lazare. Quickly the owner of the unpronounceable name and the significant title pointed to the cab from which he had just alighted, and Schwartz, whose every suspicion with regard to his princely customer bristled up in one moment, clutched his bag and followed his imposing interlocutor. As soon as they were both comfortably seated in the cab, the latter began, with courteous apology in broken but fluent English, "I must ask your pardon, sir, for thus trespassing upon your valuable time, and I certainly should not have done so but for the certainty that our interests in a certain matter which I have in hand are practically identical, in so far that we both should wish to outwit a clever rogue." Instinctively, and his mind full of terrible apprehension, Mr. Schwartz's hand wandered to his pocketbook, filled to overflowing with the banknotes which he had so lately received from the prince. "Ah, I see," interposed the courteous Russian with a smile, "he has played the confidence trick on you, with the usual addition of so many so-called banknotes." "So-called," gasped the unfortunate young man. "I don't think I often err in my estimate of my own countrymen," continued M. Burgrenev. "I have vast experience, you must remember. Therefore, I doubt if I am doing what does he call himself, Prince something, an injustice if I assert, even without handling those crisp bits of paper you have in your pocketbook, that no bank would exchange them for gold." Remembering his uncle's suspicions and his own, Mr. Schwartz cursed himself for his blindness and folly in accepting notes so easily without for a moment imagining that they might be false. Now, with every one of those suspicions fully on the alert, he felt the bits of paper with nervous, anxious fingers, while the imperturbable Russian calmly struck a match. "See here," he said, pointing to one of the notes, "the shape of that W in the signature of the chief cashier. I am not an English police officer, but I could pick out that spurious W among 1,000 genuine ones. You see, I have seen a good many." Now, of course, poor young Schwartz had not seen very many Bank of England notes. He could not have told whether one W in Mr. Bowen's signature is better than another, but, though he did not speak English nearly as fluently as his pompous interlocutor, he understood every word of the appalling statement the latter had just made. "Then that prince," he said, "at the hotel, is no more prince than you and I, my dear sir," concluded the gentleman of His Imperial Majesty's police calmly. "And the jewels? Mr. Winslow's jewels?" "With the jewels there may be a chance, oh, a mere chance. These forged banknotes, which you accepted so trustingly, may prove the means of recovering your property." "How?" "The penalty of forging and circulating spurious banknotes is very heavy. You know that. The fear of 7 years' penal servitude will act as a wonderful sedative upon the prince's joyful mood. He will give up the jewels to me all right enough, never you fear. He knows," added the Russian officer grimly, "that there are plenty of old scores to settle up, without the additional one of forged banknotes. Our interests, you see, are identical. May I rely on your cooperation?" "Oh, I will do as you wish," said the delighted young German. "Mr. Winslow and Mr. Vassall, they trusted me, and I have been such a fool. I hope it is not too late." "I think not," said M. Bergreneff, his hand already on the door of the cab. "Though I have been talking to you, I have kept an eye on the hotel, and our friend the prince has not yet gone out. We are accustomed, you know, to have eyes everywhere, we of the Russian secret police. I don't think that I will ask you to be present at the confrontation. Perhaps you will wait for me in the cab. There is a nasty fog outside, and you will be more private. Will you give me those beautiful banknotes?" "Thank you. Don't be anxious. I won't be long." He lifted his hat, and slipped the notes into the inner pocket of his magnificent fur coat. As he did so, Mr. Schwartz caught sight of a rich uniform and a wide sash, which no doubt was destined to carry additional moral weight with the clever rogue upstairs. Then His Imperial Majesty's police officer stepped quickly out of the cab, and Mr. Schwartz was left alone.